Carlos leaned against the porch railing of his modest home, watching the world wind down. His thoughts were a mix of contentment and mild unease. His wife, Linda, had been distant lately, and tonight, she was going out for a girls' night. Linda stepped out of the house, her high heels clicking against the wooden floor. Carlos looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of her. She wore a short, revealing dress, far different from her usual attire. Her makeup was meticulously applied, making her look more like she was heading to a nightclub than a casual gathering with friends. "Linda, do you really need to wear that?" Carlos asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's a bit too much for a night out with the girls, don't you think?" Linda rolled her eyes. "Carlos, you're overreacting. It's just a dress. I'll be back before you know it." Carlos frowned. I don't think it's appropriate. What if something happens?" Linda's eyes flashed with annoyance. "I'm an independent woman, Carlos. I can take care of myself. Stop trying to control me." Before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked down the steps, her head held high. Carlos watched her go, a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. As Linda walked to the driveway, Carlos followed her, trying one last time to reach out. "Linda, please, I'm not trying to control you. I'm just worried. Can we at least talk about this?" Linda spun around, her expression a mix of frustration and exasperation. "Talk about what, Carlos? You don't trust me, is that it?" Carlos shook his head. "It's not about trust. It's about respect and concern. I just feel like you're changing, and it's pushing us apart." Linda laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that sent chills down Carlos's spine. "Maybe I am changing. Maybe I'm tired of being the dutiful wife who does everything you want." Carlos's heart sank. "Is that how you really feel?" Linda's gaze softened for a brief moment, but then the hardness returned. "I'm going out, Carlos. We'll talk later." She climbed into her car, slammed the door, and drove off without another word. Carlos stood in the driveway, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. He felt a deep sense of foreboding, as if something precious was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. He walked back to the porch, the warm summer air doing little to ease his anxiety. Sitting on the steps, he tried to remember when things had started to go wrong. Linda used to be so loving, so attentive. They would spend hours talking, laughing, and dreaming about the future. But lately there had been a distance, a coldness he couldn't understand. Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos of happier times. There was one of them at the beach. Linda's face lit up with a genuine smile, her eyes sparkling with joy. It seemed like a lifetime ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Carlos decided to call his friend Mike. Maybe a distraction would help clear his mind. "Hey Mike, you free to hang out?" Carlos asked when Mike picked up. "Sure, man. What's up?" "Just need some company. Linda's out with her friends, and I'm feeling a bit down." Mike agreed to come over, and soon they were sitting on the porch, beers in hand, talking about everything and nothing. Mike tried to cheer Carlos up with jokes and stories, but Carlos's mind kept drifting back to Linda. "You think I'm being unreasonable, Mike?" Carlos asked after a long silence. Mike shook his head. "No, Carlos. You're worried about your marriage. That's normal. But maybe you should try to talk to Linda when she's in a better mood." Carlos nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right." As the night wore on, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When Mike left, Carlos sat alone in the darkness, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The clock ticked on, each passing minute amplifying his anxiety. He checked his phone repeatedly, hoping for a message from Linda, but there was nothing. Hours passed, and the house felt emptier than ever. Carlos tried to distract himself with a book, but his mind kept drifting back to Linda. The clock ticked loudly, each second amplifying his anxiety. The quiet, usually a source of solace, now felt oppressive and filled with tension. He flipped through channels on the TV, unable to concentrate on anything. The silence was deafening. Finally, past midnight, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Linda was stumbling out of a car, her arm draped around a stranger. The man's hands were all over her, his fingers gripping her waist possessively. Carlos's mind raced. Who was this guy? What had Linda been doing? The knot in his stomach tightened as he watched them laugh and whisper to each other, completely oblivious to the world around them. Linda and the stranger made their way to the front door, their laughter grating on Carlos's nerves. He stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. As they entered, the smell of alcohol hit him, and he saw the multiple hickeys on Linda's neck. His fists clenched involuntarily. "What the heck is going on, Linda?" Carlos demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. Linda looked at him with a mixture of disdain and defiance. "Shut up, Carlos. Don't try to control me, or else my lover will smash your jaw. As I told you earlier, I'm an independent woman, and I can do whatever I want." The stranger smirked, his eyes challenging Carlos. "You heard her, buddy. Better back off." Carlos's patience snapped. In an instant, he crossed the room and slapped Linda across the face, the sound echoing through the silent house. She gasped, her hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide with shock. "Carlos, you jerk!" Linda screamed, stumbling backward. The stranger lunged at Carlos, but Carlos was quicker. He pushed the man back, his voice cold and controlled. "Get out of my house." The man hesitated, glancing at Linda for guidance, but her shock had turned into a sodding mess. Realizing he was out of his depth, the stranger sneered and retreated. "This isn't over," he muttered, slamming the door behind him. Carlos turned back to Linda, who was now crying, her mascara running down her face. "How could you do this, Linda? How could you bring him here?" Linda's anger flared again. "You never listen to me. You always think you know what's best. I'm tired of being treated like a child. Is this your idea of independence? Cheating on me, bringing a stranger into our home?" Carlos's voice broke, the hurt seeping through his anger. Linda wiped her tears, her expression hardening. "Maybe it is. Maybe I needed to do something drastic to make you see how unhappy I am." Carlos stared at her, disbelief and pain etched into his face. "So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your betrayal?" Linda shook her head, exasperated. "You just don't get it, do you? It's not about blame. It's about us being over. I'm done with this marriage." Carlos's heart ached at her words. He felt a wave of sadness and resignation wash over him. "If that's how you feel, then there's nothing more to say." Linda looked away, her shoulders slumping. The defiance had drained out of her, replaced by a weary acceptance. "I'll pack my things and leave in the morning." Carlos nodded, turning away from her. "Do whatever you want, Linda. Just know that you've destroyed everything we had." He walked to the kitchen, needing space to breathe, to think. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid doing little to quench the fire of emotions raging inside him. As he stood there, he heard Linda's soft sobs from the hallway, but he couldn't bring himself to go to her. This was it, the end of their marriage. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had loved her deeply, but now, all that remained was a chasm of betrayal and hurt. As he sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, Carlos's mind raced with plans for the future. He knew one thing for certain. He would not let this betrayal define him. He would rise above it, stronger and wiser. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his heartbreak, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter. Carlos spent the next few days in a daze, his thoughts consumed by Linda's betrayal. He couldn't let her get away with this. The hurt festered inside him. transforming into a cold, calculating resolve. He needed a plan, something that would make her and her lover regret their actions. On the third morning, Carlos sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. The house was eerily quiet, amplifying the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds. He scrolled through Linda's social media profiles, noting her recent activities and friends. His phone buzzed with a message from Mike. "Hey man, how are you holding up?" Carlos replied quickly, "I've been better. I need your help with something. Can you come over?" Within an hour, Mike was at Carlos's door. He took one look at his friend and knew this wasn't a casual visit. "What's going on, Carlos?" Carlos explained everything, his voice steady but laced with bitterness. "I need to gather evidence of Linda's infidelity. Can you help me?" Mike nodded. "Of course. What do you need?" Carlos pulled out a small notebook where he had jotted down his ideas. "First, I need to track her movements. She still thinks I'm clueless, so we have that advantage. I've set up a GPS tracker on her car, and I need you to help me monitor it." Mike's eyes widened. "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" Carlos' expression hardened. "I have to. She shattered our marriage. I need to know everything." The next few days were a blur of covert operations. Carlos and Mike took turns following Linda, photographing her secret meetings with her lover. Carlos invested in a small camera and microphone, which he planted in her car and purse. Each night, he pored over the recordings, meticulously cataloging every incriminating detail. One evening, while reviewing the footage, Carlos found what he was looking for: a recorded conversation between Linda and her lover, Jason. Linda's voice was hushed but clear. "Jason, I can't keep doing this. Remember you. Carlos is getting violent, and I want to live in that home." Jason laughed. "Let him be. He's too stupid to figure anything out. We're in the clear. I will disappear him." Carlos's fists clenched as he listened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He saved the audio file and added it to his growing folder of evidence. A week later, Carlos sat down with Mike in the living room. "I think we have enough," Carlos said, his voice firm. Mike looked at the stack of evidence on the coffee table. "So, what's the next step?" Carlos leaned forward, his eyes cold and determined. "First, I'm going to confront her with all of this. She won't be able to deny anything. Then, I'm filing for divorce, but I'm not stopping there. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what she did." Mike nodded. "You sure you want to do this, Carlos? There's no going back once you start." Carlos' jaw tightened. "I'm sure. She betrayed me. She needs to face the consequences." That evening, Carlos waited for Linda to come home. The house was filled with a tense silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Carlos had replayed this moment in his mind countless times, and now it was finally here. When Linda walked through the door, her smile faded as she saw Carlos standing in the living room, a thick envelope in his hand. "Linda, we need to talk," Carlos said, his voice cold and detached. Linda scoffed, tossing her purse onto the couch. "What now, Carlos? More accusations?" Carlos stepped forward, his eyes unwavering. "No more accusations, just facts." He handed her the thick envelope. "Divorce papers. I've had enough." Linda's face went pale as she took the envelope, her hands trembling. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am," Carlos replied, his voice steely. "And I have all the evidence of your infidelity. This will go to court if you don't sign." Linda's bravado crumbled instantly. She burst into tears, her defenses shattered. "Carlos, please, we can talk about this. It was a mistake. I was confused." Carlos shook his head, his resolve unshaken. "A mistake? You call months of lying and cheating a mistake? This isn't something we can just talk about, Linda. You broke our marriage." Linda fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Carlos, don't do this. We can fix it. I love you." Carlos's eyes flashed with anger. "Love? You call this love? He threw a stack of photographs onto the floor, images of Linda with her lover in various compromising positions. Look at these. Look at what you've done. Linda glanced at the photos, her sobs intensifying. Carlos, I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. Carlos's voice was filled with bitterness. You knew exactly what you were doing, Linda. You made your choices. Now you have to live with the consequences. Linda crawled towards him, her hands clutching at his pants. Carlos, please. I can't live without you. I'll do anything. Carlos stepped back, shaking her off. It's too late, Linda. I've given you too many chances. You made it clear where your priorities lie. Linda looked up at him, her eyes desperate. I can change. I'll go to therapy. We'll go together. Please, just give me one more chance. Carlos' expression softened for a brief moment, but then he hardened his resolve. I can't trust you anymore, Linda. This isn't just about what you did. It's about who you are. Someone who would betray their partner like this isn't someone I want in my life. Linda's sobs quieted as the weight of his words sank in. She knew he was right. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What am I supposed to do? She whispered, defeated. Carlos's voice was firm but not unkind. You sign the papers. We go our separate ways. You figure out who you are and what you want. Maybe someday you'll find a way to make peace with what you've done. Linda nodded slowly, her hand shaking as she reached for the pen. She signed the papers, each stroke of the pen feeling like a nail in the coffin of their marriage. When she finished, she handed them back to Carlos, her eyes empty. Carlos took the papers, his expression unreadable. I'll file these tomorrow. You should start packing your things. Linda stood up, her legs unsteady. Carlos, I'm sorry. For everything. Carlos's face softened slightly, but his resolve remained. I know, Linda, but sorry isn't enough this time. As Linda retreated to the bedroom, Carlos sat down on the couch, the weight of the past weeks finally crashing down on him. He had done what he needed to do, but the pain of the betrayal still lingered. He knew it would take time to heal, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The house was quiet again, but this time, it was a peaceful quiet. Carlos leaned back, closing his eyes, and took a deep breath. He had faced the storm and come out the other side. Now, it was time to rebuild his life, one step at a time. The days following the divorce were a blur for Carlos. He was trying to rebuild his life. Despite the sense of relief that came with the end of his tumultuous marriage, a shadow of sadness lingered. It was in these quiet moments that he wondered if he could ever fully move on. Meanwhile, Linda couldn't handle the rejection. The reality of losing Carlos, combined with her own guilt, spiraled her into a dark place. She stopped going to work, spending her days drinking and wallowing in self-pity. Her friends grew distant, unsure of how to help, and soon she was alone with her misery. One night, Carlos was relaxing in his home, a book in hand, when he heard a loud, insistent pounding on his door. His heart sank. He knew who it was before he even opened it. You ruined my life, Linda screamed, her voice slurred and filled with rage. She pounded on the door, her fists leaving small dents in the wood. Carlos opened the door cautiously, his expression unreadable. Linda, you need to leave. But she didn't listen. Her eyes were wild, her makeup smeared from tears and frustration. I loved you, Carlos. I gave you everything. And you just threw it all away. Carlos sighed, trying to remain calm. Linda, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it off. She lunged at him, her hands clawing at his face. Carlos defended himself, pushing her away gently but firmly. She stumbled, her anger making her unsteady, and in a horrific moment, she lost her balance completely. She fell backward, hitting her head on the corner of the coffee table with a sickening thud. Linda, Carlos shouted, rushing to her side. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and she was unconscious. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking. 911. What's your emergency? My ex-wife. She's hurt. She fell and hit her head. Please send an ambulance. Carlos's voice was frantic. The operator's calm voice guided him through the steps to ensure Linda was breathing and to stop the bleeding as much as possible. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the sound of sirens filled the night air. The paramedics arrived and took over, their efficient movements a stark contrast to Carlos's frantic state. As they loaded Linda onto a stretcher, Carlos stood back, feeling numb and detached. He followed them to the hospital in his car, his mind racing with fear and guilt. At the hospital, Carlos sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. The bright lights and sterile environment did little to calm his nerves. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached him. "Are you Carlos?" the doctor asked. Carlos stood up, his heart pounding. "Yes, that's me. How is she?" Linda suffered a concussion and a deep cut on her forehead. She's stable now, but we'll need to keep her overnight for observation, the doctor explained. Carlos let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded and led him to Linda's room. She was lying in the bed, looking pale and fragile, a bandage wrapped around her head. Her eyes fluttered open when Carlos approached. "Carlos," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here, Linda," he said softly, sitting by her bedside. "You need to rest." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Carlos, for everything." Carlos's heart ached. Despite everything, he still cared for her. "I know, Linda. Just focus on getting better." In the days that followed, Linda was discharged from the hospital, but the incident had a profound impact on her. Her lover, hearing about the accident, vanished from her life, leaving her even more alone and broken. She entered therapy, trying to piece her life back together, while Carlos continued to move forward with his own healing process. They remained in touch, if only sporadically, each trying to find their own path to recovery. Though their marriage was over, the bond they once shared was a reminder of both the good and the bad, a complex tapestry of love, betrayal, and ultimately, growth. In the end, both Carlos and Linda realized that healing was a journey, not a destination, and as they walked their separate paths, they carried with them the lessons of their shared past, hoping to build better futures for themselves. Months passed, and Carlos slowly began to rebuild his life. The memory of Linda's betrayal still lingered, but he was determined not to let it define him. He focused on his career, taking on new projects and earning the respect of his colleagues. The routine and challenges of work became a welcome distraction, allowing him to regain a sense of purpose. One sunny Saturday morning, Carlos decided to explore the local farmers market. He had recently developed an interest in cooking, finding solace in the precise, creative process of preparing meals. As he wandered through the stalls, he marveled at the array of fresh produce, artisanal breads, and homemade jams. "Try this, sir," an elderly vendor offered, holding out a slice of freshly baked apple pie. Carlos took a bite and smiled. "This is amazing. I'll take two." As weeks turned into months, Carlos's social circle expanded. One Friday night, Carlos found himself at a cozy wine bar, laughing with a group of friends. Among them was Christine, a witty, intelligent woman who had recently moved to town. They hit it off immediately, bonding over their love of books and nature. "Have you read the latest from Stephen King?" Christine asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Carlos grinned. "I have. What did you think of it?" They spent the evening deep in conversation, and as the night wore on, Carlos felt a connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was refreshing and hopeful, a sign that he was truly moving on. Linda, on the other hand, struggled to find her footing. The divorce had left her with nothing, and her reputation was in tatters. She moved away, trying to start over in a new town where no one knew her past. But the shadow of her actions loomed large, making it difficult for her to escape the guilt and regret that haunted her. One day, as she sat in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, Linda received a call from an old friend, Karen. "Linda, I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" Karen asked. Linda sighed, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm trying, Karen. It's hard. I messed up so badly." Karen's voice was gentle. "We all make mistakes, Linda. The important thing is to learn from them and move forward. Have you thought about seeing a therapist?" Linda nodded, even though Karen couldn't see her. "I have. I think it's time I did something about it." The following week, Linda started therapy. The sessions were difficult, forcing her to confront her mistakes and the pain she had caused. But they also provided her with a path to redemption, a way to understand herself and find a semblance of peace. Back in his new life, Carlos continued to thrive. He had built a support network of friends who genuinely cared for him, and he found joy in the simple pleasures of life. He and Christine started dating, and their relationship grew steadily, based on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, as Carlos and Christine walked hand in hand along the beach, she turned to him and said, "Carlos, you've come such a long way. I'm so proud of you." Carlos looked at her, gratitude filling his heart. "Thank you, Christine. I couldn't have done it without the support of people like you." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the ocean, Carlos realized that he had finally found peace. The scars of his past remained, but they no longer defined him. He had destroyed the cheating wife and her lover's arrogant facade with a calculated nuclear revenge. But more importantly, he had rebuilt his life with strength and wisdom. Carlos stood on the porch of his new home, watching the sun set over the horizon. The vibrant hues of orange and pink painted the sky, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The past year had been a whirlwind of emotions, but he had come out stronger on the other side. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about the lessons he had learned and the new life he was building. The door behind him opened, and Christine, his new girlfriend, stepped out, wrapping her arms around his waist. Her presence was a soothing balm to his still healing heart. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft and reassuring. Carlos took a deep breath, letting the crisp evening air fill his lungs. "Just about how far I've come," he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's been a journey." Christine nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've been through a lot, but you're an incredible person. I'm lucky to have you." Carlos turned to her, his heart full of gratitude and love. "And I'm lucky to have you too. You've been my rock." Christine smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "We make a good team, don't we?" Carlos chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, we do." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The future seemed bright, filled with endless possibilities. Carlos felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Later that evening, they went inside to prepare dinner. The kitchen was filled with the delicious aroma of roasted vegetables and baked chicken. Carlos and Christine moved around the space in perfect harmony, each knowing exactly what the other needed without a word. "Can you hand me the rosemary?" Christine asked, stirring a pot on the stove. Carlos reached for the herb, passing it to her with a smile. "Here you go." "Thanks," she said, adding it to the dish. "This smells amazing." "It does," Carlos agreed, feeling a sense of contentment. Cooking together had become one of their favorite activities, a way to bond and create something beautiful together. As they sat down to eat, Carlos looked around the dining room. The walls were adorned with pictures of their adventures, hiking trips, beach days, and cozy nights in. Each photograph was a testament to the new life they were building together. "To new beginnings," Carlos said, raising his glass in a toast. Christine clinked her glass against his. "To new beginnings." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where they settled on the couch with a bottle of wine. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their plans for the future. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared memories. "You know," Christine said, her eyes twinkling, "I've been thinking about taking a trip, just the two of us, somewhere we've never been." Carla's interest peaked. "That sounds amazing. Where do you want to go?" "I've always wanted to visit the Pacific Northwest," she replied. "The forests, the coastline. It sounds so beautiful." Carla smiled. "I love that idea. Let's do it." Christine leaned in, giving him a soft kiss. "I'm so excited. It's going to be an adventure." Carlos felt a surge of happiness. The prospect of exploring new places with Christine filled him with anticipation. It was a stark contrast to the emptiness he had felt after his divorce. As the night wore on, they snuggled on the couch, watching a movie and enjoying each other's company. Carlos couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed. The pain and betrayal of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had shaped him into a stronger, more resilient person. Before heading to bed, Carlos stepped out onto the porch one last time. The stars twinkled in the night sky, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the endless possibilities it held. He took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the new beginning he had been given. Christine joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Ready for bed?" she asked, her voice gentle. Carlos nodded, looking at her with love and appreciation. "Yeah, I am." As they walked back inside, Carlos knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. With Christine by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, confident that together they could overcome anything. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.